By August 1944, following the explosive breakout from Normandy, General George S. Patton's Third Army had a singular purpose: to tear through the heart of Europe and force the Germans to their knees. The landscape of France, soaked in the blood of both sides, bore witness to their relentless march. It was an advance unlike any in history. Armored vehicles, infantry units, and tanks sliced through villages, pushing the retreating German forces further back with every hour. The headlines back in America were filled with stories of victories, the kind of victories that seemed almost mythical. Patton's forces were unstoppable, a freight train of military might plowing its way through the German defenses. But behind the roar of the tanks and the trumpets of success, something dark was unfolding. Behind those victories, Patton's men were facing a deadly, insidious crisis. The faster they moved, the more lives were being lost, not from enemy fire, but from the brutal realities of war itself. His army was running out of officers, junior officers to be specific, and the loss of those officers meant that the very thing holding the army together was starting to fracture. Because an army is not just a collection of bodies with weapons. It is a finely tuned machine, one that operates on a rigid chain of command. When that chain breaks, the machine stops working, and that was exactly what was happening on the front lines. The lifeblood of Patton's army, the second lieutenants and captains, were being cut down faster than replacements could arrive. The reality of being a junior officer in World War II was horrifying. The average life expectancy of a platoon leader in combat was terrifyingly short. Some units saw their new officers killed in action within 2 to 6 weeks of being deployed. It was a staggering number, but a truth that was as brutal as it was real. The reason for this was not simply the sheer violence of war. It was the deadly precision of German tactics. The Germans were masters at targeting leadership. They understood the battlefield in a way that almost made it seem like they had studied the psychology of leadership itself. They knew that if they killed the man giving orders, the rest of the unit often froze. So the snipers and machine gunners of the Wehrmacht knew exactly where to look. They would scan for the officers, young men standing tall, moving decisively, their helmets with silver or gold bars glinting in the chaos. These were the targets, and the results were catastrophic. Junior officers were being systematically hunted, and the American infantry was paying the price. But what Patton saw next was something that would change the entire course of his army's strategy, and something that many would later criticize, but which proved to be one of his most brilliant and perhaps most controversial decisions. Patton realized that he could not wait for a slow-moving bureaucracy to send replacements. He couldn't afford to waste months filling positions with inexperienced men who would become liabilities. Instead, he turned to something far more radical. He began to promote soldiers on the spot. Not just any soldiers, but the ones who were already proving themselves in the heat of battle. The sergeants, the men who had been there, who had fought, who knew the ground, and who had earned the trust of their men. And when he gave them that promotion, it wasn't a formality. It was a declaration of trust, a declaration that the battlefield, not the paper-pushing bureaucracy back in Washington, defined who was worthy to lead. This decision was not just a matter of filling vacancies, it was about survival. Patton was a pragmatist first and foremost. He didn't care about rank, about shiny uniforms, about paperwork. He cared about getting the job done. And when a young officer died, he knew that the Army's backbone, the sergeants, were the ones who could hold the line. He didn't need more officers from the training centers. He needed men who could lead under fire. The veterans, the ones who had survived Sicily, North Africa, and now Normandy. These were the men who could carry the banner of leadership, regardless of whether they had a degree or not. So Patton did something that had never been done before. He began issuing battlefield commissions to those NCOs, non-commissioned officers, who were proving themselves capable on the front lines. The result was nothing short of revolutionary. But Patton's actions did not go unnoticed by his superiors, who saw it as an administrative nightmare. The War Department and the personnel offices back in Washington had an entire system in place to promote officers, a system designed for peacetime, a system that required forms, evaluations, background checks, and sometimes even an act of Congress. To them, Patton's actions were reckless and chaotic, but Patton didn't care about bureaucracy. He cared about winning the war, and in that moment he chose to do whatever was necessary to keep his army moving forward. Patton would drive out to the front lines, stepping over the bloodied terrain and into the chaos of battle, and find the NCOs holding the line. He would go up to the sergeant, often covered in mud and blood, his uniform torn, and ask, "Who is commanding this company?" The sergeant would stand at attention, nervous and confused. "I am, sir." "All the officers are dead." Patton, without missing a beat, would reach into his pocket, pull out a set of silver bars, his own personal stash, and pin them to the sergeant's chest. "Congratulations, Captain," he would say. And that sergeant, who had been leading by instinct and experience, would immediately take command. No paperwork required. These men were not trained in officer schools. They were not West Point graduates. They were regular men who had learned to lead through hardship, by facing the reality of combat, and by proving themselves in the heat of battle. And now, they were leading entire companies. Patton's decision to bypass the system was a stark rebuke to the bureaucrats back in Washington, who saw order and discipline as more important than the reality of war. Patton, however, knew better. He understood something that many in the War Department could not. He knew that leadership was not defined by paperwork, and it wasn't defined by school or family lineage. It was defined by action, by presence, and by the ability to stand up when everyone else is waiting for orders that will never come. In the heat of battle, the rules of war are not always as simple as strategy and tactics. What makes a real leader is their ability to adapt, to think quickly, and to act with an unwavering commitment to their men. Patton understood this fundamental truth, and it guided every decision he made, no matter how unorthodox or controversial. The promotions he handed out were not just about filling a role. They were about giving the men a reason to believe in their leadership. They were about proving that anyone, no matter their rank or education, could rise to the challenge if they had the courage and the grit to lead in the moment. The impact of Patton's decisions rippled through the entire Third Army. His men began to understand something crucial. Patton saw them not as cogs in a machine, but as essential components of the whole. The lesson was clear. If you fought hard enough, held the line, and kept your men alive, Patton would reward you with the ultimate mark of trust. He wasn't waiting for some distant office to decide who was worthy. He'd decide for himself, in the dirt, on the front lines, where the fate of the army was hanging in the balance. It didn't matter if you were a college graduate or a high school dropout. It didn't matter if you had a silver spoon in your mouth, or if you had spent your whole life working in factories or farms. All that mattered was whether you could lead your men through the next obstacle, through the next challenge, through the next moment of chaos and fear. As the Third Army pushed further into France and then into Germany, the Army's leadership transformed. Veterans of the Great Depression, men who had known hunger and hardship, were now leading companies, divisions, and battalions. They had spent years learning the art of survival, and now they were putting those lessons into practice. The difference was clear. These were men who had not just been given their rank, they had earned it through blood and sweat. And that made all the difference when the bullets started flying. The men under these battlefield-promoted officers trusted them in a way they had never trusted other commanders. They weren't following someone who had memorized a textbook. They were following someone who had fought beside them, who had shared in the same dangers, who understood what it meant to survive when everything seemed stacked against you. When Patton looked around at the battlefield and saw these seasoned NCOs rising to the occasion, he knew his gamble was paying off. He had bypassed the system, yes, but in doing so, he had created an army that trusted itself. And in war, trust is the most powerful weapon any man can wield. But this wasn't just a matter of leadership on the front lines. It was a psychological battle as well. Patton's actions were not just a statement about his belief in his men. They were a direct challenge to the bureaucratic structure that had defined the military for so long. He was sending a message to the entire army and to Washington that the rules could be bent, even broken, when the need was great enough. Patton's approach may have angered the higher-ups who preferred things to run according to protocol. But it was exactly what the men on the ground needed. It was a signal that, for once, the bureaucracy was secondary to the men actually fighting the war. And in the end, it was the men who were going to win it, not the generals sitting in safe offices far from the front. But not everyone was on board with Patton's revolutionary approach. Back in Washington, the War Department was livid. They had an entire system in place, one that ensured promotions were earned according to regulations, checked and double-checked by countless bureaucrats. They had processes in place for medical exams, background checks, and personnel reviews. To them, Patton's actions were reckless, irresponsible, and a logistical nightmare. They feared that the ad hoc promotions Patton was making would disrupt the Army's structure, cause chaos, and create a mess of paperwork they would have to clean up after the war. But Patton ignored their complaints. He didn't have time to wait for paperwork. His tanks were advancing, his infantry was bleeding, and his men were dying. He needed leaders now, not in 3 weeks, not after weeks of training, not after completing mountains of paperwork. He needed them now. And so Patton kept on promoting. He kept on looking for the men who could lead, who could inspire, who could hold their ground when the world was falling apart around them. He didn't care what the War Department thought. He cared about the men under his command, and he knew that the only way to keep his army moving forward was to give his best soldiers the power to lead. And so it continued. The young green replacements from officer candidate schools came and went, but the heart of Patton's army was made up of men who had proven themselves. They had earned their places, not through paperwork or education, but through sheer will, through determination, and through their willingness to sacrifice everything for the men beside them. They were men who understood war not from a textbook, but from experience, and that experience made them invaluable. As Patton's army continued to push through France and into Germany, the men under these battlefield-promoted officers found themselves fighting not just for victory, but for a sense of pride. They were not just soldiers in a war. They were part of something bigger, an army that trusted its leaders, no matter where they came from. And that trust, that belief in each other, would be one of the things that propelled them forward, even when the end of the war was still far from sight. Patton's battlefield promotions became a symbol of his leadership philosophy, practical, ruthless, and focused on the immediate needs of the men in the field. He wasn't concerned with rules, he was concerned with winning the war, and in that he succeeded. His army became a force unlike any other, a force that trusted its leaders and, more importantly, trusted each other. It was a force that had learned to adapt, to fight, and to survive, no matter the odds. But the story didn't end with the end of the war. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Patton's men returned home. They had fought the greatest war in history, and many of them had been promoted in the heat of battle. But the army was shrinking. The war was over, and as the military downsized, the same bureaucracy that Patton had defied during the war returned to reassert control. As the war came to a close, Patton's soldiers, the very men who had risen through the ranks under his unorthodox system, faced an even more insidious enemy: the return of the rigid military bureaucracy that had been suspended during the war. When the immediate threat of Nazi Germany was defeated and peace loomed, the military's priorities shifted. The army had to return to its peacetime structure, a structure defined by regulations, rules, and the kind of paperwork that Patton had so frequently ignored in favor of immediate, battle-driven action. For many of Patton's battlefield-promoted officers, this return to the bureaucratic fold was nothing short of humiliating. Those sergeants who had been handed the silver bars of commissioned officers in the mud of the front lines were now stripped of their ranks in a process that almost felt like betrayal. They had been entrusted with the command of entire companies. They had led men through some of the fiercest fighting of the war, and they had earned the respect of their peers and subordinates alike. But now, the Army's bureaucracy, the very machine Patton had sought to bypass, was determined to undo what he had done. The war was over, but the scars of it, physical and psychological, remained. Many of these battlefield officers had seen things that could never be unseen. They had led their men through hell, with the knowledge that the next corner, the next patch of earth, might be their last. They had given orders knowing they might not make it out of the next firefight, and had done so with the kind of leadership that made others follow without question. But now, they were reduced to something less than they had been, a technicality in a system that no longer saw them as heroes but as misfits who had stepped outside the lines. This was a harsh reality that many of Patton's men were forced to accept. They had been heroes in battle, but in peacetime, the same system that had allowed them to rise to greatness now sought to erase their contributions. The army had never prepared for men like them, men who had not earned their rank through traditional means, but through the sheer force of their will and their ability to lead under fire. Some of these battlefield-promoted officers were quietly stripped of their new commissions and returned to their enlisted ranks. Others found themselves in a kind of limbo, where they were recognized as officers in the field, but had no formal standing in the Army's peacetime structure. They were a reminder of the price Patton had paid for defying the system, men who had been given the mantle of leadership in a time of crisis, but whose efforts were now being quietly erased as if they had never happened. This is where the tragedy of Patton's leadership style truly reveals itself. In the heat of battle, when lives were on the line, when every decision could be the difference between life and death, Patton had been a visionary. He had understood that leadership was not about rank or paper. It was about action, about survival, about proving yourself in the moment. But when the war ended and the need for immediate action faded, the very system that had tried to stifle his efforts during the war reasserted itself. And with it, the battlefield leaders he had created were slowly forgotten. The story of Patton's battlefield promotions is in many ways a story of the disillusionment that follows the end of war. The men who had fought for so long, who had seen the depths of hell and returned with the scars to prove it, now found themselves sidelined, their leadership rendered meaningless in the eyes of the military bureaucracy. They were reminders of a system that worked in the heat of battle but fell apart once the crisis was over. It is easy to romanticize war, to look at it through the lens of victory and glory, but the true cost of conflict is often measured in the aftermath. For Patton's soldiers, the victory over Germany was not followed by a hero's welcome, but by the crushing weight of a system that could not see them for what they had become. Their service was reduced to nothing more than paperwork, and the very thing that had made them heroes in the eyes of their comrades was now ignored by the very system that had been supposed to honor their sacrifice. The question remains, was it worth it? Was it worth defying the rules, breaking the bureaucracy, and creating an army of men who knew how to lead in the heat of battle? For Patton, the answer was clear. He had done what was necessary to win the war. He had turned a collection of men into a fighting force, a machine of war that could not be stopped. But for the men who had been promoted in the heat of battle, the story was different. They had been transformed by war, but the world they returned to could not understand the kind of leadership they had shown. In the end, Patton's most significant weapon was not his tanks, his tactics, or his speeches. It was his pragmatism, his willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve victory. He understood that in war, survival is often about the ability to break the rules when the situation demands it. And in that, he was a leader of unmatched foresight. But his greatest legacy, one that is often overlooked, was his ability to recognize the value of his soldiers, not by their paper qualifications, but by their actions. They were the ones who led when others faltered, who fought when others hesitated, and who made the difference between victory and defeat. For Patton, they were the true heroes. But for the bureaucracy that followed, they were nothing more than temporary leaders, their value measured in paperwork, not in blood and sacrifice. As the dust of World War II began to settle, a new chapter was written not just in history books, but in the lives of those who had fought on the front lines. The war had ended, and with it came the promise of peace. But for many soldiers, especially those who had fought under Patton's leadership, that peace was anything but restful. The world they returned to was not the one they had left. They had faced hell on the battlefield, and now they were being asked to return to the grind of everyday life, where the stakes were not life and death, but paperwork and bureaucracy. And as they returned home, many of Patton's battlefield-promoted officers were faced with the harsh reality of being forgotten. It was a cruel irony. The very men who had proven themselves in the most intense and dangerous conditions were now being treated like mere cogs in a machine, their hard-earned ranks and leadership stripped away by the bureaucracy they had fought so hard to defy. The military, now that the immediate need for action had passed, was determined to reassert control and restore its peacetime structure. And that meant undoing what Patton had done, reducing battlefield leaders back to their original enlisted ranks, erasing their service as if it had been a momentary glitch in the system. Many of the men who had risen through Patton's unconventional promotion system were caught in a system they no longer recognized. They had been given the power to lead, to make life or death decisions on the battlefield, but now they were being told they didn't meet the necessary standards to lead in peacetime. They were not educated in the ways of peace, in the art of diplomacy or negotiations, or in the intricacies of military administration. They were warriors, not office workers. Their education had come from years of surviving the brutal realities of war, not from attending officer candidate schools or West Point. For many of them, the loss of their commission was not just a blow to their status. It was an affront to their very identity. They had fought, bled, and led men through some of the most hellish conditions imaginable. They had seen their comrades fall, and they had kept moving forward. Yet in the end, the same bureaucracy that had almost failed them in the midst of battle was now stripping them of the recognition they had so clearly earned. The system, so quick to reward the theory of leadership, now disregarded the brutal and real lessons learned in the field. But Patton's actions, though controversial, had left a lasting imprint on the army. Even though the bureaucrats sought to undo his work, Patton's battlefield promotions proved a profound truth. The best leaders are often those who have proven themselves in the most extreme circumstances, not those who have followed the system or the rules. Patton had understood this better than anyone. He had seen firsthand that leadership could not be distilled into a set of qualifications or paper credentials. It had to be forged in the fires of combat, and the men who had led in the crucible of battle had a kind of wisdom and experience that could never be replaced by a degree or a certificate. And so, even as the system sought to erase Patton's revolutionary approach to leadership, something within his men had changed. The battlefield promotions had transformed them. They had stepped up in the most difficult of circumstances, and they had seen the results of their decisions. They had learned to trust each other, to rely on one another in ways that transcended formal rank. And though the army sought to reduce them to mere enlisted men again, they knew deep down that they had earned their place as leaders, not just by virtue of their rank, but by the sacrifices they had made and the decisions they had made under fire. These men, now relegated to the back pages of history, were the forgotten heroes of World War II. They had no grand speeches or awards to show for their service. Their story was not one of glory and honor, but one of quiet resilience in the face of a bureaucracy that did not understand the true cost of war. And yet, their legacy remained. It lived on in the soldiers who had fought with them, in the stories passed down in whispers in the barracks and around campfires. It lived on in the very ethos of the army that Patton had helped to shape. In many ways, the story of Patton's battlefield commissions is the story of a paradox. Patton, the ultimate military aristocrat, a man of great wealth and privilege, had defied the rules in the most extraordinary way. He had bypassed the bureaucracy, not out of disdain for it, but because he knew that in war, the rules could be deadly. In his view, the battlefield was not a place for paperwork and formalities. It was a place where men needed to be able to trust their leaders, where leadership was not about titles or paperwork, but about action, decisiveness, and the ability to inspire men to follow you through hell and back. Patton had seen the truth that many of his superiors never did, that the best leaders were not always the ones with the most polished resumes, the ones who could navigate the corridors of power with ease. The best leaders were the ones who had fought beside their men, who had faced the same dangers, who had bled and sweated and struggled with their troops. And when Patton's battlefield-promoted officers returned home, stripped of their commissions, and forced to live in a world that didn't understand the value of their experience, that truth remained. They had proven themselves as leaders, not through the bureaucracy, but through the fire of combat. And though the military sought to erase them, their legacy endured. It wasn't written in the official records, but it was written in the hearts and minds of the men who had served under them. They knew what those men had done, what they had sacrificed, and how they had led when it counted most. And in the end, it was that kind of leadership, the kind that Patton had fostered, the kind that had risen in the crucible of war, that would define the future of the army, even if the bureaucracy couldn't see it. And so Patton's legacy was sealed, not in the annals of military tradition, but in the hearts of those who had followed him, fought for him, and, above all, learned from him. He had been a leader of extraordinary pragmatism, a man who knew that in war, survival wasn't about following the rules. It was about doing whatever it took to win. And in the end, it was that unflinching willingness to break the rules that made Patton one of the greatest generals in history.